amigos lá?
Não, lá em São Francisco.
Ah,
Luke, acho que é Luke. Chegou a ver?
não vi. Foi cancelado, não foi?
Foi.
Luke é sobre o que? Verismo?
Não, um grupo de amigos gays.
Ah, é?
É.
Tá boa.
São Francisco.
Eu não sei de nada. Eu tô aqui fazendo meu trabalho. Você que tá aqui fofocando me atrapalhando. Eu vou avisar a Denise que você vê que tô me desconcentrado.
Vai fofocar.
É.
Não, agora a gente vai lembrar. O pessoal deve estar chegando, né? Essa hora.
É, o que foi divulgado foi, mas se as pessoas não vierem,
Não vai
não
estar
posso fazer
acontecendo.
muita coisa, mas assim, acho que elas que perdem, né?
Você bem inteligente. Vamos lá. Vamos ver se tem por acaso, né? Texto, estamos cheios de gente. Ih, vai no Rock in Rio?
Eu queria ter
Era.
ido no Ariano, mas eu
Ainda
não
vai
consegui
ter.
comprar ingresso.
Eu tinha até uma conhecida que estava vendendo, mas ela quer vender inteiro.
Eu até compraria. Sabe o que eu fui assistir sábado? O balé de Genebra, lá no Teatro Nacional.
É.
Muito bom.
Bacana.
Interessante. Só foi caro.
Tinha uma francesa ali
Foi tão
cantando
caro que
Edith
eu
Piaf.
saí de lá e fui imediatamente dormir. Tanto sono. Foi tão absurdamente caro. Ai, meu Deus.
Deu pra fazer mais nada.
Não deu pra
Não, mas
fazer
vale a
mais
pena.
nada. Não dava nem pra comer um
Por
Big
que você não foi
Mac.
numa tartinha, assim?
Porque eu queria convidar uma pessoa especial, mas a pessoa deu pra trás, aí o que eu vou fazer? Acontece, né, Márcia? Fazer o quê?
Infelizmente. Aí tu conseguiu vender o outro ingresso?
Não vendi não, levei outra pessoa,
Ah,
substituí,
ah,
né? Mas eu marquei com 2 semanas de antecedência, olha só que sacanagem. Coisa feia, né? Mas tudo bem, eu tô acostumado.
não, acho que você consegue. Eu não gostei muito do primeiro show, não, do Rock in Rio. Vamos ver se esse pós-Ballet Funk vai ser melhor. Tava lá no primeiro. É agora, acho que é sexta, né? Sexta-feira.
Uhum.
Deixa eu ver minhas fotos. Deixa eu passar.
Oi,
Oi.
beleza, maravilha. Tudo bem? Normalmente a gente tem mais
público do que isso. Eu não sei se é porque é Lovecraft. Assim, se dependesse de mim, seria o contrário, né? Mas tá cheio de gente aqui, porque é fascinante, é super legal. E a gente hoje tem, então, esse privilégio de ter a visita aqui do professor Philippe Met, que está no Rio participando de um evento. Desculpa, meu óculos aqui teve um acidente. Ele está participando de um evento bem legal que está acontecendo no Fórum de Ciência e Cultura lá no Flamengo, se alguém tiver interesse. Não tem nada a ver com Lovecraft, é sobre poesia contemporânea, mas me pediram para distribuir isso aí para vocês. Passa aí, por favor. E o Felipe, então, hoje ele já falou na UF sobre Robert Bresson e Francis Ponge, poeta francês. E aqui, para vocês verem como ele é um cara versátil, o Felipe concordou em falar para a gente sobre Lovecraft e cinema. Mais especificamente, né, as adaptações da obra do Lovecraft para o cinema. O Philippe Met é professor de poesia francesa, moderna e contemporânea, século XIX e XX, trabalha ainda com literatura fantástica, especialmente francesa, belga, americana, inglesa e alemã, e com filme e cinema, né? Principalmente autores franceses em cinema e gêneros como horror e policial. Ele é o editor em chefe do French Forum, um membro do conselho de vários jornais, periódicos acadêmicos, é autor de mais 60 artigos e capítulos de livros, né, que vão de temas assim os mais diversos, desde até graphic novels, história em quadrinhos, literatura e cinema. Ele escreveu como autor livros como Formule de la Poésie, Études sur Ponge, Léry, Char et Debussy. Fórmulas da Poesia, Estudos sobre Ponge, Léry, Char et Debussy, poetas franceses, e La Lettre Tue, Spectre de l'écrit fantastique, a letra mata, espectros da escrita fantástica. Ele contribuiu para a coleção da Pleiade, famosa coleção Pleiade, né, na edição das obras completas do Francis Ponge, e editou também Entre Debussy e esses outros, na editora Lettres Modernes. Também como um volume de Nu sobre o poeta francês Yves Charnay. Pardon. E com Jean-Louis Letras e Suzanne Lindra-Gig, ele trabalhou na edição crítica de Frédéric de Tovarnik, nos scripts para um filme que nunca foi completado, do Alain Resnais, que é Les Aventures de Harry Dixon. E, no momento, atualmente, ele está terminando o manuscrito de um livro sobre a estética e fenomenologia de cadernos de nota poéticos, que vai ser publicado pela editora Rodopi. E está pesquisando 2 projetos novos, bem interessantes. Um sobre a figura da criança e as representações da criança, da infância, em filmes de horror. Bem interessante isso aqui. E outro sobre o fantasma... Não é o fantasma no cinema, é sobre cinema fantasma. É uma categoria muito interessante, que, na verdade, são filmes que nunca foram realizados. Filmes que ficaram apenas em projeto. Então, ele tem chamado essa categoria de filmes inexistentes como Ghost Cinema, né? Ele é regularmente convidado para dar palestras em várias instituições acadêmicas e de pesquisa nos Estados Unidos, na Europa, na Austrália e na Ásia. Tá? Então, hoje a gente vai ter o privilégio aqui de ter o Philippe Met falando sobre esse tema fascinante, que é essa questão de se Lovecraft é ou não um autor que pode ser, de fato, filmado, né, transposto para o cinema. Então, eu vou convidar o Philippe para vir aqui à mesa. I can stay there if you want me to change it. Do you wanna sit down or stand up? Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
I think it's going to be easier for them.
Sure.
Thank you for the slides. Well, thank you very much, Eric, and it's very nice to be here. Sorry, I'm sort of sitting in front of a computer here, and yep. Ah. Okay, so it's fine in English? Yeah? Okay, good. So, yeah, I want to talk about Lovecraft and cinema and whether Lovecraft is unfilmable or not. And I want to start by saying that Lovecraft was born 5 years before the invention of the cinématographe by the Lumière brothers. The Lumière brothers invented the cinema as we know it today in 1898, and Lovecraft was born in 1893. But since Lovecraft thought of himself as a gentleman from the 18th century, and therefore felt alienated in a contemporary society that he abhorred, it is certainly no surprise that he held the nascent seventh art, cinema, in contempt. Only 3 years before his passing, before he died, he still clung to the idea of, and I quote him, it's from a letter in his huge correspondence, so he still clung to the idea of, quote, the utter and unrelieved hokum of the moving picture. Hokum is sort of an outdated word in English, meaning basically trivial nonsense, if you will, right? So the utter and unrelieved hokum of the moving picture. In an earlier epistle, in an earlier letter, he used the equally scathing phrase infantile twaddle. Infantile twaddle, basically the same meaning, foolish, idiotic stuff. One should mention that such a harsh perception of cinema as irretrievably futile, unredeemably asinine or stupid, is or was predicated on a fairly narrow, essentially linear and literal conception of the adaptation process on Lovecraft's part, which by and large is still prevalent today, as we will soon notice. Instead of a complexified dialogic perspective, which would be more appropriate and accurate to rethink questions of intermediality or remediation. Not even the horror genre was spared by Lovecraft's barbs in his, again, voluminous correspondence, including such now iconic classics as Dracula, Todd Browning's Dracula, or James Whale's Frankenstein, both released in 1931. So that a list of films that Lovecraft truly enjoyed and appreciated would be quite succinct, quite brief indeed. Few films that he said he enjoyed in his correspondence: The Invisible Man, but there's also The Lost World, The Phantom of the Opera, The Invisible Man. I already mentioned that one, and hypothetically, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, whose reputation made Lovecraft regret that he did not get a chance to see it. Not to mention here and there a comedy from the 1910s or a melodrama from the 1920s that somehow Lovecraft enjoyed, but that's outside of the horror genre. In sum, Lovecraft's distaste for the filmic medium might not have equaled some of his well-known phobic detestations. He detested alcohol, he detested seafood, for example. And that certainly did not prevent him from frequenting movie theaters. We know that Lovecraft did go to the movie theater once in a while. But clearly in his eyes, the so-called seventh art could never attain the lofty heights of the thespian art and stage production. Are we then to read the relatively late, we're talking 2 decades after his death, the relatively late and overall, I think, unfortunately, unconvincing illustration or rendition of Lovecraft's oeuvre on the silver screen? Are we to consider it as a fair shake, as sort of a looping of the loop, a fitting looping of the loop, meaning Lovecraft did not like cinema, it seems, and cinema did not really like Lovecraft, to some extent? we're going to discuss that question here today. In a sense, one of the very first, albeit not unproblematic, screen adaptations of Lovecraft, Roger Corman's The Haunted Palace, 1963, is a case in point. There are very few, if any, explicit screen adaptation of Lovecraft before 1963 and Roger Corman's The Haunted Palace. And yet it is problematic. Why? Because under the guise of an umpteenth installment in the popular and lucrative Edgar Allan Poe cycle that Corman was famous for and still is today. And of course the title, The Haunted Palace, borrows from a very famous poem. I mean, we're not going to read the poem here today, but a very famous poem by Edgar Allan Poe, The Haunted Palace. So this was obviously a sort of a marketing ploy on Roger Corman's part. So the Haunted Palace, meaning Roger Corman's film, is actually based on Lovecraft's The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. Although some critics have in fact argued that in the end, Roger Corman's film references neither Poe nor Lovecraft, right? It's something else. It's using bits and pieces and elements from Poe and Lovecraft, but it's neither a Poe-esque nor a Lovecraftian film, if you will. Regardless of the specifics, and we're not going to go into the details here, but what I find interesting is that the unstable status of the Corman film is, in a way, a reflection of the difficulties inherent in the delimitation, indeed the constitution, of a hypothetical corpus of Lovecraftian films. And that is despite the existence today of an H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival. It was created in 1995 in conjunction with this Cthulhu convention, which targets a mostly Fannish audience, a Fannish audience that understandably does not really care about the questions that we are here discussing. And it's, of course, it's a divide that we run into time and again when we're looking at genre cinema. There's the scholarly side and the Fannish side, and the two do not always coincide. But that's another issue. And that said, I think it is arguably, and I'll try to show this later in my talk, it is arguably in this direction, I mean the films produced within the context or for the purpose of this festival, this H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival, that one should look for newer or better efforts, be they of an amateur or semi-professional order. Again, I will eventually return to this point later in my talk. But first I want to look at the taxonomic presuppositions that tend to prevail among contemporary critics of Lovecraft on celluloid, and in particular the dichotomy between adaptations based upon Lovecraft, and generally those adaptations based upon Lovecraft are described as both superficial and renascent, sort of a bizarre terminology. So we have this type of adaptations on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have the films inspired by Lovecraft, meaning inspired by the imaginary worlds as part of the so-called Cthulhu mythos, right? And so inspired by the imaginary worlds and the idiosyncratic atmosphere emanating from Lovecraft worlds. And those adaptations are usually and unexpectedly, bizarrely called totemic. When I'm using this terminology, I'm actually referring to, or in particular, to an essay by Andy Black in a periodical he founded in the late 1990s. It's now a defunct journal, and this journal was called, in homage to Lovecraft, Necronomicon, the Journal of Horror and Erotic Cinema. Um, so, of course, the implied separation of form from content, of plot from ambience, or maybe I should say Stimmung, using a term by Gumbrecht, or the separation of letter from spirit. All of that, of course, is, to say the least, very questionable as a point of methodology. And it is continued with such studies as, you can seek them out if you like, the complete H.P. Lovecraft filmography, published in 2001 by Charles P. Mitchell, The Lurker in the Lobby, I like the title, The Lurker in the Lobby, A Guide to the Cinema of H.P. Lovecraft, published in 1995, reprinted in 2006, by Andrew Migliori, who initiated the creation of the above-mentioned film festival, or H.P. Lovecraft in Popular Culture, the works and adaptations in film, television, comics, music, and games, published in 2006 by Don G. Smith. In the Mitchell book, for example, a presumed opposition is established between primary and secondary adaptations. Each entry starting with, quote, key Lovecraft ingredients. I'm not really sure whether we're talking sort of a cooking culinary recipe or sort of an alchemical formula. So we have key Lovecraft ingredients for each entry, followed by a fidelity to Lovecraft section. So again, we keep running into those classic presuppositions. An adaptation should be faithful to the original, and so on and so forth. At the other end of the spectrum, a somewhat loose or impressionistic Lovecraftian influence is often posited or tracked down by critics in works that range from The Creature from the Black Lagoon in 1954 to, of course, a name that comes up in connection with Lovecraft, John Carpenter. So, for example, The Thing or The Fog, or Prince of Darkness, or In the Mouth of Madness, also by John Carpenter. But the list includes Robert Wise's The Haunting, Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, Peter Weir's The Last Wave, Australian horror film, Ridley Scott's Alien or Prometheus, Japanese side, Takashi Shimutsu's Maribito, or Mariano Baino's Dark Waters. The same critics have also come up with a set of putative obstacles to successfully adapting Lovecraft's tales to the big screen. So what are those obstacles? Huh? What would constitute the unfilmability of Lovecraft? According to those critics, again. So the first obstacle, stumbling block that comes to the fore is the presumed primacy of atmosphere over action that we find in most of Lovecraft's tales. Indeed, the frequent passivity and powerlessness of the protagonist, as you might know if you've read some Lovecraft, most of the narrators, most of the protagonists are academics, scholars, or antiquarians, as Lovecraft calls them. So the sort of a passivity or powerlessness of those protagonists when faced with the monstrous eruption or incursion, this is but one example, right? And indeed, Lovecraft himself seems to have repeatedly questioned his own abilities in terms of action writing. And there are many letters where he says, "Oh, I'm not good at action writing," basically. Which, of course, does not preclude very efficient moments of suspense or sequences of that nature in some of his stories. I'm thinking in particular of The Shadow over Innsmouth, a fairly late novella by Lovecraft, which might have indicated a new trend, who knows, in Lovecraft's writing style. Maybe he would have moved into a more action-oriented, action-writing-oriented also kind of style, who knows. But otherwise, more generally, we find really tightly structured storylines and elaborate multi-tier narratives in Lovecraft. In addition, I should say that Lovecraft's Commonplace book, and the Commonplace book was a notebook where between 1919 and 1935, Lovecraft jotted down concepts and ideas that he planned to revisit when developing later works of fiction. Well, that Commonplace book contains numerous what I would call narrative nuggets that more often than not come across as brief synopses or embryos of cinematic scenarios with a definite emphasis on visuality, even if in most cases we're talking still of frozen images rather than moving images. Another supposedly major stumbling blocks in terms of adapting Lovecraft to the screen, at least again from the perspective of mainstream cinema, right? Mainstream cinema, where again, and you have to keep in mind that we're, of course, talking mostly Hollywood type of cinema. But so mainstream cinema, let's say, where again, narration, or the plot, if you will, the narrative, is the principal interface in the adaptational process. So other stumbling blocks would include, one, the brevity, the brevity of the majority of Lovecraft's tales. They're short. They're short stories, novellas at best, at the longest. Hence, the assumed necessity when adapting those short stories to the screen, the assumed necessity of padding or hybridizing, borrowing from various texts. Right? And I refer you, for instance, to Stuart Gordon's Dagon, or especially from Beyond. Another important stumbling block from the perspective of mainstream cinema is the quasi-absence of female characters in Lovecraft. Quasi-absence of female characters, and therefore absence of a romantic or erotic, at least on an explicit level, angle, if you will. Right? So again, major problem for mainstream cinema or Hollywood cinema, certainly. Third major stumbling block, I would say, and again, this is not my perspective, I'm sort of synthesizing and summarizing what most critics are saying. Another important major stumbling block, certainly from a US and American politically correct perspective, well, the disreputable ideological substratum underpinnings of most Lovecraft stories. And therefore, it is no surprise that to my knowledge, all screen adaptations, without fail, of Lovecraft take great pains to eliminate the racial, racist, racialist, xenophobic, whatever term you want to use, strain from the original tales of Lovecraft. Fourth, was it fifth? I forget. Another major stumbling block is the monsters, the great old ones, the ancient gods that we find in Lovecraft's stories. What I call the teratological pantheon of Lovecraft. How are you going to visualize all of those ancient gods and monsters on the screen? Not to mention also in most of Lovecraft stories, the Cyclopean constructions, the non-Euclidean geometry, the cosmological threat, and the indifferentist underpinnings, all of which would necessitate, again, from a very basic point of view, all of which would necessitate a substantial special effects budget, even for Hollywood. And in that regard, Lovecraft's earlier text, more conventionally Gothic or Poesque in nature, avoids, for the most part, that constraint. There remains another major stumbling block. There remains the complex relation of Lovecraft's writing to language, and in particular, Lovecraft's writings' emphatic reliance on the rhetoric device, it's ancient, if you're familiar a little bit with ancient rhetoric, it's the figure of hypothesis. Hypothesis is the classic, vivid, picturesque depiction of scenes or events, creating the illusion of reality. So we're talking a sort of at once visual and haptic kind of figure speech. So the rhetoric, emphatic reliance on that rhetoric device of hypothesis, with also an oxymoronic mix of excess and obstruction, frontality and indirection, a mix of the Baroque and the ineffable. Again, major stumbling block. The initial description of the bas-relief in the Call of Cthulhu immediately comes to mind. What is the description about? Well, it is presented as the result of an overactive or somewhat extravagant imagination, and it blends heterogeneous referential details in terms of comparing elements that are used to describe that sculpture, if you will, that bas-relief. There's a reference to octopus, to dragon, to human caricature. So this is those heterogeneous referential elements mixed with an abstract or indeterminate totality or entity. Again, I refer you to that passage in the Call of Cthulhu, and I'm quoting from it. Lovecraft refers to the spirit of the thing, or refers to the general outline of the whole. So all of this would be akin to what a critic or a philosopher, Graham Harmons, calls a deliteralizing gesture. This is from Graham Harmon's book, Weird Realism, which is a study of Lovecraft informed by object-oriented philosophy or speculative realism, which has its merits, but which I find deeply flawed in other respects, and in particular in its tendentious and repetitive micro-analyses which do not engage really with existing Lovecraft criticism and scholarship, and there's a huge bulk of Lovecraft scholarship, and it sort of ignores it, or it pretends that it somehow essentially boils down to Edmund Wilson's hostile and frankly objectionable reading of Lovecraft some 70 years ago. Since then, there's been a slew of critical stuff on Lovecraft, some of which is not that interesting, but some of which is really good. And Graham Harmon is pretending that this does not exist, which I find a bit problematic. But anyway, but still, I'm going to refer a little bit to Graham Harmon's book here, and basically his thesis is that the creatures in Lovecraft stories are not reducible, as the empiricist tradition would have it, to a bundle of qualities. The creatures, and the way they're described, this is not reducible to a bundle of qualities. Of course, bundle of qualities is a phrase borrowed from British philosopher David Hume. Let me try and explain. On the one hand, the real objects in a phenomenological sense, the real objects are caught, and I'm quoting from Graham Harmon here, are caught in an impossible tension with the weakened descriptive powers of language. And on the other hand, I'm quoting again from Graham Harmon, the visible objects display an unbearable seismic torsion with their own qualities. I'll give you another, maybe clearer example. If you go back to the description of Wilbur Whately's decomposing body in the Dunwich Horror, I'm going to quote very quickly from it. That decomposing body, I'm quoting from Lovecraft, could not be vividly visualized by anyone whose ideas of aspect and contour are too closely bound up with the common life forms of this planet and of the three known dimensions. There, however, and that's typical Lovecraft, after saying that, there follows a very meticulous and plethoric description that concomitantly seals the inaccessibility to literal visualization. Now, despite these negative and disqualifying or unfavorable elements, I now want to turn to salient examples of what I think are potentially original, innovative screen adaptations, transcriptions, or translations of Lovecraft's universe, however far apart they might be in terms of period, style, production, national tradition, and above all, adaptational strategies and protocols. And I'm going to start with Italy. And I'm starting with Italy because Italy is probably the European country, along with France, which has garnered the most active interest over the years, since several decades. The most active interest, both critical and editorial, for Lovecraft's achievements. But maybe I'm going to skip a few examples here. We have, but I do recommend it, the HP, this one here, to my right, to your left, I guess. HP Lovecraft, Ipotesi di un viaggio in Italia. Un documentario, it's actually a sort of, docu-fiction, one might say, a sort of a speculative biopic, which is very interesting. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but if you get a chance to check out that film, it's really original and unique. I'm going to skip that one. Of course, we have a film like the wonderful, and I love him very much, Mario Bava, Kaltiki, the Immortal Monster, which, of course, with a sort of a monstrous blob, which is quite clearly based on Lovecraft on some level. We have Ivan Tsukon, L'Altrove. It's actually a trilogy. We have L'Altrove, then we have this is the title in English, The Shunned House, La Casa Sfuggita, I think in Italian, and Color from the Dark. But I want to focus on Lucio Fulci, the gore meister, Lucio Fulci, so-called the Italian zombie guy, who's famous or infamous for not only his visceral aesthetic, his predilection for mutilation of all kinds, especially ocular perforation or splintered eyeballs, but also for a dream logic, in most of his films, a dream logic transgressing customary narrative conventions, that is transgressing linearity, sequentiality, causality, and so on and so forth. And Fulci's appropriation of Lovecraftian tropes is refreshingly non-explicit, non-systematic, and is primarily noticeable in his Living Dead or Gates of Hell trilogy. Paura nella città dei morti viventi, well, maybe I'll say the title in English, City of the Living Dead, 1. 2, probably Lucci's most famous film, L'Aldilà, the Beyond. And 3, Quella villa accanto il cimitero, the house by the cemetery. So we're talking the early 1980s, 1980, 1981. All starring Catriona MacColl, all shot, for the most part, in the U.S., respectively for City of the Living Dead, shot in Savannah, Georgia, The Beyond shot in New Orleans, Louisiana, and Concord near Boston for House by the Cemetery. Hence, a sort of a suggested Southern Gothic backdrop for the first two films, and a New England milieu dear to Lovecraft, of course, for the third one. Now, the question I want to try and consider is, could it be that the Fulci signature, again, is formal excess, sort of an in-your-face or a kind of horror, so formal excess and gore hyperbole? Could it be that this Fulci signature functioned as an equivalent of Lovecraft's own hysterical, overblown rhetoric? So that we would be a sort of equivalent between literary language and cinematic language here. The main action of City of the Living Dead is set in the town of Dunwich, regardless again of the actual shooting in the Deep South, and seems to invoke from the outset a memorable couplet from the Necronomicon, familiar to all and any Lovecraft fans. I'm quoting that couplet: "That is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die." So it's sort of echoing that famous couplet with a somewhat, and I don't have a picture of it, and I apologize for that, but it's a tomb inscription, and it's a sort of a somewhat tautological inscription. Again, it's complicated because I'm quoting here, of course, from the American DVD release. And so there's a lot of complexities with those films in terms of production, distribution, international distribution, cut and re-edited releases and versions and so on and so forth. But at least on the American DVD release, we have that tomb inscription: "The soul that pines for eternity shall outspan death." The soul that pines for eternity shall outspan death. So on top of the curious outspan coinage, outspan is not really a verb that is commonly used, at least in English. But on top of that, the end of the epitaph, the tomb inscription, appears to be spectacularly agrammatical. I'm quoting again the end of the epitaph: "You dweller of the twilight void, come Dunwich." One is presumably supposed to read in accordance with the initial address, "You dweller." Maybe we're supposed to read, maybe it's like a typo, like a misprint. "The soul that pines you dweller of the twilight void, come to Dunwich. Come to Dunwich." Unless Dunwich functions as a signature of the addresser. In other words, as if this were a prosopopoeia. Again, a prosopopoeia is a sort of old rhetorical figure where an inanimate object or an animal speaks. So as if the city of Dunwich were speaking. I don't know if you're following me, but it would be, "You dweller of the twilight void, come. Signed, Dunwich." The authorial intent here is likely situated at the intersection, all right, the equidistance of these two hypotheses. Although a reduplication of the equally paradoxical and pleonastic, equally polysemous and undecipherable tenor of the lines from the Necronomicon that I've quoted, that couplet, that is also possible. Rather than recycling this arguably cumbersome archetype of the evil forbidden book, and the Necronomicon is well known to most enthusiasts of Lovecraft or horror fiction, let's say. So rather than using the Necronomicon, Fulci is foregrounding another book, another forbidden evil book in Lovecraft. It's called the Book of Eibon, E-I-B-O-N. So that's a screen grab from Fulci's film. It's an evil book that was first invented not by Lovecraft, but one of his disciples, Mark Ashton Smith, and then reappropriated by Lovecraft. But the film, Fulci's film, is also foregrounding a non-Euclidean geometry commonly found in Lovecraft again. Furthermore, the striking sepia prologue of the film, and that's maybe where I want to show a clip. You're going to see in a second that the striking sepia prologue of the film features the canvas of a painter tortured to death. And that painting will eventually turn out to be, at the end of the film, to be the exact representation of hell or limbo. Now, maybe I'll show the clip a little bit later on, very soon, I promise. This is, at the end, we see the two protagonists sort of entering the canvas. It's entering, walking in that sort of lunar landscape, which is supposed to be a representation of hell or of limbo, if you will, right? and we don't quite know how the two protagonists end up in that landscape. But they seem to be doomed to wander in that lunar landscape until the end of times. Now, is it? Let me see. No, this is. Yeah. Is it that Fulci remembered the sinister paintings of the eponymous artists of another tale by Lovecraft? The tale is titled Pickman's Model. It's basically the story of the narrator has a painter friend, right? And that friend paints monstrous creatures, right? And sorry, if you haven't read that major spoiler coming up, if you haven't read that really short story, I'm sort of spoiling the suspense for you, sorry. So this painter pretends that he's just imagining those monsters. I mean, those monsters are basically creatures from his imagination. But the narrator at the end of the film will find an actual photograph of a monster, so that he realizes that those paintings that his friend painted are actually from life. They're not imaginary creatures. They're real creatures. Anyway, so those paintings in Pickman's model eventually proved to be not the emanation of a deranged mind or the pale imitation of illustrious predecessors like Fuseli or Goya, but portraits from life. Of course, with the noticeable difference that the painting of Fulci's artist, Maudit, cursed artist, is surprisingly here subdued and deserted, where the rest of the film, of Fulci's film, literally oozes with liquid matter and predominantly blood. I mean, this is quite recurring in Fulci's film. He's not the gore meister for nothing, right? But here, of course, we have this sort of landscape that conjures up, maybe, Yves Tanguy's, a famous surrealist painter, Yves Tanguy's both mineral and metaphysical landscapes. Here, strewn with undecidable abstract objects, beings. In Fulci's films, you can't really see here, but maybe you can see right here. These are supposed to be calcified dead bodies, right? Right here, right? So, yeah. So maybe a parallel with Tanguy's film. It's another film by another painting by Yves Tanguy. Right? So in a sense, Fulci's endings symmetrically inverts the shock of the Lovecraftian coda. It presents its negative, almost in a photographic sense, in, of course, a completely different context. The abominable creature caught on the spot, or again, from life, is substituted with the expected scene or background on the photograph that the narrator had retrieved from Pickman's studio or lair. Okay. So again, in Fulci's film, it is the individual who, by virtue of ontological and metaphysical fusion, if you will, is destined to enter the canvas. Another reason I'm bringing up that story, Pickman's model, is that it has lent itself to numerous film adaptations, mostly TV adaptations over the years, starting with an episode from the celebrated TV series back in the day, in the early 1970s, on American television, Night Gallery. So this film here, Pickman's Model, is from this season 2 of that TV series. And it presents interesting additions or alteration compared with the original story. For example, substituting for Lovecraft's Thurber, we find the narrator and the painter's friend in the original story. We have a female, you can probably see her there, here, a female character, Miss Goldsmith, who falls prey to a sort of red-eyed, scaly monster. we find in that night gallery episode, we find a sealed well in Pickman's cellar, which is opened up in the present time of the denouement finale by two men looking for the missing canvases of the artist, thereby reawakening the beast therein. So all of that stuff is not in the original story. Closer to us, again, I can't really go into the details here. It's not a completely successful adaptation, but it is very interesting for this particular photograph here. Basically, again, the whole point of the Lovecraft story is that at the very end, we as readers see and we do not see at the same time the actual photograph. Right? So, of course, this element is almost like a taboo element for a screen adaptation. If you're a director trying to adapt that story, there's one thing you don't want to do is try to show that photograph on the screen. That's Giovanni Furore precisely went down that route, which I find pretty bold and pretty audacious, and sort of successful here. I don't know whether you can really see it here, but I'm going to try and describe and explain that shot, that screen grab for you here. If I can find my thread. So that it's a short feature. Right? It's a short feature. It's hampered by lots of stuff and poor acting in particular. The acting is really mediocre. It's not good in that short feature. But again, it has that audacious displaying of the cursed snapshot in the end. It's very brief, but if you take a close look, and that's why I have that screen grab here. If you take a close look at that shot here, what you find is the repulsive model juxtaposed, the monster, if you will, juxtaposed with the photographer. They're juxtaposed here on the print. And the photographer is reflected with his, I don't know if you can see it here, but it's reflected here in a mirror, right? So what we have is a shot of the protagonist, the painter, supposedly, himself. So of course there's a mise en abîme effect. Of course here we have the painter taking a picture of his own monstrous model. Interestingly enough, seems to have breast. It's like a strange incarnation of that monster. Huh? And the photographer himself, photographer / painter, is reflected in this round mirror here. And we don't see it here, but in the film, that mirror is positioned on an easel. Easel, you know, that usually the frame, the wooden frame where a painter will position his canvas or her canvas to paint. So there's really a sort of a specular mise en abîme, right? Here that I find really interesting and really successful. That's sort of a metafilmic effect here. So what we have here, in a sense, that's the way I read this particular moment, that particular shot here. We have a doubled portrait of the artist as a monster, so to speak, which might remind one of the pictorial principle pronounced by Pickman in the Night Gallery version that I referred to earlier. And I'm quoting from that Night Gallery episode: to paint what you actually see, you must first paint what you actually are. To paint what you actually see, you must first paint what you actually are. And of course, the repetition of actually signifies, almost in an etymological sense, the ontological primacy of the actual over the virtual. Another interesting adaptation of that same short story by Lovecraft is Chilean, like from Chile, Chilean Gothic, by Ricardo released in 2000. Also, fairly remarkable adaptation, I think, of that story. Not only because of its intelligent and diversified use of the voiceover narration, or the judicious reproduction of Goya's famous painting, Saturn devouring his son. Why? Well, because that Goya painting is most likely the source of the painting titled Ghoul Feeding. Ghoul Feeding in the Lovecraft story. But also, I think this Chilean Gothic film is successful for its, again, mise en abîme of the scopic drive and the question of representability. Of course, the scopic drive and the question of representability are both at the heart of Lovecraft's original tale, Pickman's model. If the actual monstration of the monstrous manifestation is elided, avoided, via the use of subjective camera in Chilean Gothic. So instead of showing the photograph, it's purely a subjective camera moment. So we don't have the counter shot, if you will, of the monster. But in that film, it is the actual monstrosity of the compulsive witness/investigator that is eventually visualized by a Polaroid of his lugubriously carnivorous face, and the back of which bears the telling mention, Pickman's model. So on the back of that photograph, the Pickman's model. But I want to return to and I'm going to show the clip later on, but soon. I want to return to Fulci for a minute. Strikingly, the Christian iconography foregrounded, especially in the Beyond, by Fulci, by a director whose Marxist leanings are oftentimes overlapping with Fulci's Catholic roots. Italianness oblige. I mean, this is quite current with Italian directors. But of course, this Christian iconography seems to stand in stark contrast with Lovecraft's well-known atheism. Not only will the scenes leading to the ending in Fulci films gratify us with blood oozing from a canvas, but equally shocking is the martyrdom of the painter necromancer right from the outset. And this is the clip I'm going to show. And this is clearly a mob lynch moment. I find it interesting that the story is set in New Orleans, Louisiana, 1927. So this is the Deep South, 1920s. Lynching black men was quite current at the time. So it is a mob lynch moment, but with, of course, the Fulci touch. And as we're going to see now with that clip, if I can play it. Let's see if I can find it here. It should be here. Do I have time to show it? Can I show a few minutes? Yeah. Maybe I should, sound, yeah.
In this book are collected all the prophecies of Aban, handed down from generation to generation over more than 4,000 years.
Ungodly warlock. Because of you, this hotel, this town, will be cursed forever.
The 7 dreaded gateways are concealed in 7 cursed places. Woe be unto him who ventures near without knowledge.
Be careful what you do. Because this hotel was built over one of the 7 doors of evil. And only I can save you.
Another example, the Andrew Lemon, real quick. Again, so I have an entire comment on the Fulci film, but I want to look in conclusion. I want to look at the opposite end of the spectrum, really. Look at a much more recent, as well as much more literal effort, in particular, The Call of Cthulhu. Released in 2005. This is a medium-length feature by Andrew Lemon. And it's very interesting because it was shot in the vein of a silent, I was going to say almost a German expressionist film from the early 1920s. From the early 1920s, that is, that corresponds to the time period of the writing of the original short story. That is the kind of film that Lovecraft might or would have seen at the time. And this sort of retro effect was achieved through the use of early or vintage cinema techniques and artifacts that would not have been unfamiliar to Willis H. O'Brien, the creator of stop motion animation, for example. So using miniatures and puppets, title cards, iris vignettes, iris opening and closing, forced perspective, mirror trickery, and so on and so forth, with high definition digital imaging thrown in the mix for inlaying purposes, so that the so-called mythoscope, and that's a term that the director used for this technique, the mythoscope, referring of course to the Cthulhu mythos. I'm going to skip here some stuff so that I can show you. Let me see. First, I need to minimize this, or maybe just quit this. Yeah. So this is the Lehman film, The Call of Cthulhu. Okay, and there's another film, but that is less successful, I think, than The Whisper in the Darkness. But anyway, so what I find interesting with Lehman's Call of Cthulhu is that it stays fairly close to the source text, with the exception of a frame story. That said, that frame story is still completely coherent and consistent with classic Lovecraftian thematics and narrative structure, as we know. Lovecraft stories are full of inserted, embedded narratives and so on and so forth. It's going to be a bit difficult because I need to use the other... It's on the other DVD, so I need to get this one out. It should be. I think it's here. Sorry, if I just. Oh, okay. That's because I'm trying to. Oh, trying to get. Oh, we lost. We seem to have lost the computer as well. I was trying to hit the disk. Oh, here we go. Oh, I just pressed on that button there to eject the disk. Okay, so. So this I don't need. Okay. I just want to minimize this. It's not showing up? No. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you. So okay, this is the start of the film. So the film opens with, actually I'm going to need that PowerPoint again. Is it? No, is that the PowerPoint? No, that's not the PowerPoint. Where's the PowerPoint? Here? Yeah? Okay, thank you. Okay. So of course you will have recognized at the beginning of the opening frames of the film a gyrating close-up of Van Gogh's iconic and visionary masterpiece, Starry Night, La Nuit étoilée, complete with arabesque and the disproportionate nocturnal sky and the planets in the sky bearing down on a tiny village, peacefully, or so it seems, it might be deceptive, peacefully nestled in the foothills. In the film, an overhead, as we just saw, zoom out gradually reveals this landscape/painting to be actually a jigsaw puzzle, with a human hand hesitating to add the last piece and finally giving up on completing the puzzle. Next to it lies a pile of documents, one of them titled The Horror in the Clay, which is the title of the first chapter in the Call of Cthulhu, in the original Lovecraft tale. So a pile of documents on a table around which two men face each other. A request from one of them to burn all of those papers, which is again a very Lovecraftian gestures. If you don't burn those papers, then they're going to haunt you for the rest of your life, right? Or haunt your successors. Right? And it finds, so this I like very much this idea of burning all the papers, because I think it finds a visual echo in the imposing, twisting, flame-like cypresses, the trees there in the foreground, to the left of the painting, in the foreground of the Van Gogh painting, as well as we just saw in the wisp of smoke from the other man's pipe, or in the blinding light coming through a window and overexposing the protagonist face until his own shadowy silhouette, as we just saw, is superimposed on it in a stunning, almost like doppelganger-like chiaroscuro effect. I don't have time to show you the end of the film. I'm just going to summarize it for you and almost done. At the other end of the film, the narrator disassembles the jigsaw puzzle with a brushing swipe of his hand. The viewer then realizes, again, this is at the very end, this is in the epilogue of the film, the viewer then realizes that just as the hero at the end of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, just as Knock, waiting for the arrival in town of his master Orlac in Nosferatu, and just as Van Gogh himself, painting his Provençal Starry Night, that the protagonist of the Lehman film has been confined to a mental institution. Again, this is not really part of the original Lovecraft tale, but I think it's a very clever and very interesting twist there. The protagonist in the film at the end is next wheeled off. I mean, he's in a wheelchair. We don't realize here, but he's actually sitting in a wheelchair. He's wheeled off by a nurse until he disappears through a door frame, and he's literally engulfed in the darkness, as if this were a fade to black effect, if you will. So the puzzle can, in the end, be construed as a perfect analog of Lovecraftian cognition and narration, which, of course, the incipit of the Call of Cthulhu is the best exemplum of, with this notion of the imbrication, articulation, and correlation of seemingly disparate or incompatible elements and data. And if I have time, I'm just going to read very quickly from this very famous start of the incipit of the tale. So this is Lovecraft, the start of the Call of Cthulhu. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance, in the midst of black seas of infinity. And it was not meant that we should voyage far. Excuse me. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little. But someday, the piecing together, very important, the piecing together, and that's a phrase that Lovecraft uses very often, the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. It's a wonderful, wonderful beginning for a novella. The rest of Lehmann's film teems with similar ingenious oblique metaphors of visual innovations, and I could go on and on. But one could also dream of what a superb horror filmmaker like Mario Bava might have done with such a material. Anyway, it would be probably be presumptuous on my part to offer a grandiose conclusion on such a loaded and vast question as the unfilmability of Lovecraft. After all, as is stated at the end, not the beginning, but at the end of The Call of Cthulhu, who knows the end? Who knows the end? The cycle of Lovecraft's screen adaptation has by now become somewhat cumbersome. A lot of B-series or Z-series movies. To the extent that a recent and somewhat opportunistic critical volume is titled H.P. Lovecraft Goes to the Movies, when in fact it is just a collection of classic text by the author that's inspired supposedly equally classic films, according to the subtitle of the book. One may assume, on the contrary, that such classic films are still sorely lacking and presumably will continue to be lacking for quite a while. Too many promising yet ultimately shelved projects have risen to sink again. I'm thinking in particular of Guillermo del Toro's adaptation of the Mountains of Madness. I'm thinking of Richard Stanley's project of adapting The Color of Space. And of course, all fans are waiting but desperately for those projects to hit the screens. So many promising projects have risen to sink again, and of course, rising and sinking. I'm of course referring to the ending of The Call of Cthulhu. But we can at least imitate the great old one, Cthulhu, in the sunken city of R'lyeh, and we can all dream and wait. Thank you.
Merci, Philippe. Thank you. E a gente tem tempo para perguntas. Então, se vocês quiserem fazer em português, eu posso também fazer para ele.
It's just a curiosity question, actually. It's because your object over here was basically long films. And I've seen recently a few really short films about Lovecraft. And it was incredible for me to see how good they were, actually. And I was just wondering if you have seen some of these films, or you were just aiming on the big ones. And
I have, but I wanted to give a more general overview. I mean, I thought that already Lovecraft, maybe that's a sort of an obscure topic for a lot of people. So I thought if I'm going to really focus on lesser known, although probably very interesting short films in particular, you're right. I mean, the short features, and probably that's an indication that doing a full-length feature adaptation of Lovecraft's tales, I mean, is not an easy task. It's true. Basically, you have to probably try your hand at the longer novellas by Lovecraft, The Shadow Out of Time, the case of Charles Dexter Ward in particular. So, no, the reason I wanted to sort of do a sort of a synthesis of what had been said by critics about screen adaptations of Lovecraft over the years. I wanted to look at the really, the better known, if you will, the iconic examples in terms of screen adaptations of Lovecraft. And then I wanted also to, again, compare someone like Fulci, who's just recycling some elements from Lovecraft and not really interested in literally adapting one of Lovecraft's stories. And on the contrary, a more recent, and after all, not that well known. I mean, the Andrew Lemon's film is not that well known, I guess, and which is a more literal and more quote-unquote faithful, if you will, adaptation, and see, what kind of comparison we're going to have there. But I'm sure there are many. Some of them I've seen, but not all of them. So I'd be curious if you have suggestions and recommendations in terms of the recent short.
One today that was called The Other Gods.
Okay.
And it was made in the 1920s, and the director, it's a short animation, 6 minutes.
Oh, okay.
And he showed Lovecraft.
Yeah.
Lovecraft loved it, but some reason it didn't go on. And
Yeah.
in 2005 or 2006,
Yeah.
they got the movie back and put it. It's on YouTube.
It's on YouTube. Okay. What you remember the title of the film? The Other Gods. The Other Gods. Okay. Yeah. I'll check it out. But it dates from the 1920s?
Yeah.
Wow. Incredible. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You're right. I mean, it's an interesting point because to me, it's either. I think the most interesting stuff probably is at both ends of the spectrum. So in other words, a really big budget project. But again, we're waiting for them, and Guillermo del Toro maybe can pull it off in terms of a sort of a big budget, major blockbuster kind of film, because he's a true lover of the genres and because he's done good stuff, in the past, really good, interesting films and so on and so forth. So maybe he can pull it off. Otherwise, I think we're really looking at the obscure gems, at the really short features, and the sort of more experimental stuff, if you will. In that sense, the Andrew Lemon film is on an experimental basis.
You mentioned that one of the possible reasons why it's so difficult to film Lovecraft is because his stories relied a lot of the construction of atmospheres.
Yeah.
And sometimes atmospheres are difficult to show.
Yeah.
Of course, it has a bit to do with the Gumbrecht's idea of Stimmung, and you can only point to Stimmung, you cannot describe a Stimmung. And I'm also reminded of a famous line by Borges, the Argentinian writer, when he is describing the way we have a nightmare, and he says, first we create the idea somehow, we create the atmosphere of the dream, and then the dream work creates the images. So for him, that comes first. Could you please develop a little bit on that, on this idea of, Lovecraft is a constructor of ambience, is more than a writer of visual effects.
I mean, I don't know that I can really pursue that point much further, other than the fact that, again, as I mentioned, that it's a major stumbling block for mainstream cinema. Certainly, I mean, what is striking, as I tried to demonstrate, what is striking. I'm not the first one to mention this, of course, but what is striking, what is so different from other horror writers, what is so different in Lovecraft is that almost inevitably the main protagonists are overwhelmed. They're sort of paralyzed. They're not even interested in fighting those monsters. I mean, there's no heroics going on there. And of course, it's no coincidence that most of those narrators / protagonists are cerebral. scholars, savants, antiquarians, to borrow the term from Lovecraft. And so there's this sense that, so it's not just Stimmung, it's not just ambience, it's the, so I like a reference to Borges because, in a sense, yes, it's more like being caught in a bad dream and there's strictly nothing you can do about it. And you're virtually paralyzed, frozen in front. Again, Shadow over Innsmouth is sort of an exception, and it's a great story. So that is really, I think, very difficult when you have to do a sort of visual rendition.
Do you know the short story by Borges?
Which one?
There Are More Things.
There are more. Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Because it's also the same basic idea. You never get to see the creature. It's always the constriction of some kind of experience that you never actually see, but you feel that something is going on.
That's right. And this story supposedly was inspired by Lovecraft. To Borges. So yeah, right. So again, I don't know that Gumbrecht, although he's read everything, but I don't know whether he's read Lovecraft. But I thought about it, adapting this concept of Stimmung to read Lovecraft, but I haven't really thought about this. I don't know what it would lead us to, but it would be an interesting exercise, I think, to do. Yeah. And it hasn't been done. I don't think that there's been any Stimmung-oriented readings of Lovecraft. So that would be an interesting exercise. Yeah.
I was wondering, because you spoke of Carpenter, John Carpenter. Yeah, and I thought about Halloween. I was watching that again last week, I think. And sometime Dr. Loomis says that when he looks into the eyes of Michael Myers, he sees pure evil. And I'm trying to evoke Lovecraft. I read Lovecraft a long time ago. And I remember the unspeakable evil, the ambience, so overwhelming. Yeah. And I don't know, I was wondering if this kind of horror can be read in as a Lovecraftian horror, this human character, but its evil is it's overwhelming and then can't be traced or placed. And the other thing I would like to know is how do you see this almost absolute absence of female characters? Lovecraft.
Okay, so two questions in one. So you were going back to Halloween, to Carpenter's Halloween, and so on and so forth. Well, the question of evil is of course a complex one in Lovecraft. Because again, Lovecraft is trying to stay away from the typical Christian, dichotomy between good and evil and so on and so forth. And the difficulty with Lovecraft is the terminology on the one hand, and of course those terms, including really rare, outdating terms that that Eldritch and all those terms that Lovecraft keeps using. So there's semantic side of things, right? And indeed, Lovecraft uses those terms. Those monsters are evil. And on the other hand, there's the imaginary world and construction put in place by Lovecraft, where this dichotomy, this Christian dichotomy between good and evil is completely irrelevant, right? And of course, this goes back to what is usually referred to as the indifferentism of Lovecraft. The fact that it's not a question that there's an evil universe or world out there. It's just that this world, this universe, those monsters, those ancient gods do not really care about us, right? And they're going to crush us. The Shakespeare quote always comes back to me, except because I'm getting older, I cannot memorize as well. As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. I can't remember. They play with us for sport or something like that, right? I mean, it's just, sorry, apologize to Shakespeare. So that would be a major. So that's for your first question. That would be the major difference, if we will, between a film like Halloween, where you have incarnated evil, and of course that goes with also American Puritanism. That's I could go on and on, but you know what I'm talking about. So your second question was the female, yeah. Stuart Gordon is an interesting example there, because precisely he's trying to create sort of really in-your-face erotic horror that is not. What's that? With Reverend in particular, which is not there certainly on an explicit level in the stories by Lovecraft. What I would like to see personally is precisely a film that intelligently brings to the fore all that stuff that is not there on the surface in Lovecraft, but it's there buried underneath. It's all, to use a Freudian term, is all repressed, actually, right? And so showing that perhaps there is a sort of a deviant sexuality in the teratological creatures and all the monsters that we see. That's, of course, the better known concept is that, Lovecraft's own racist tendencies and leanings and fears and phobias and so on. Of course, that's to a large extent what Lovecraftian fiction is about. All of that stuff is being, in a way, fictionalized, right? Sometimes not that. And sometimes very explicit and very realistic. I'm thinking of a story like The Horror at Red Hook, which is pretty clear in terms of monstrosity equals the racial otherness. But perhaps we need to do more readings in terms of, the repressed sexuality there, the repressed femaleness, if you will. Right? Where is it exactly? Again, I mentioned the late novella, The Shadow over Innsmouth, where you have more action-oriented sequences, but also where you have this really intimate lineage. What's interesting also, for example, in Fulci's film is that, and it's something, of course, an area that I'm interested in, the figure of the child and representation of childhood in horror cinema, right? It's there very often. It's recurrent in Fulci's film. It's not there at all in Lovecraft. No children. Except in a way, in an indirect way, in The Shadow over Innsmouth, where the monster, the narrator. Sorry, I'm going to spoil the story for you again, for those who haven't read that story. But it's a beautiful story, where the narrator at the end realized that he is actually one of them. He's a sort of a. He's the result of crossbreeding. And of course, when crossbreeding, of course, the racist underpinnings are obvious there. But he's the result of crossbreeding between a human and a monster. And so, slowly but surely, he's reverting to the monstrous status. And so that he realizes at the end, he's also going to have to dive into the water and be rejoined with his ancestors, his monstrous ancestors, living down in the sea and so on and so forth. Right? So, and I think it's the lineage, if memory serves, I haven't reread the Shadow over Innsmouth in a long time, but it's through his grandmother. So the female element would be there. It's interesting that precisely the monstrously, so his grandmother copulated with a male monster. And so he's the offspring of that. It's just that with time and with age, he is gradually reverting to his monstrous identity. He's losing his human identity. And so on. Again, sort of a topos of horror fiction, but it's framed in a very original manner in this. So that would be the only example of a. There's also there's the Dreams in the Witch House, female witch. So there are a few exceptions, not that many. But I think what would be more interesting to me is to show how through the female figure, absent or quasi-absent figure, to show how the sexual stuff is there and not there. It's both present and absent in Lovecraft stories. I must say I'm not necessarily a big fan. I mean, the Stuart Gordon films they're fun. They're fun to watch. And of course, Robert Crampton for male viewers, heterosexual male viewers there. But again, Stuart Gordon was on to something. I mean, I think that stuff is there. He's not completely making it up. I think that for my taste, it's a bit too obvious and too grotesque and a bit too overly sexualized, if you will, and too far away from the original Lovecraft. But there's something there that should be, again, explored in other cinematic adaptations, hopefully. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Just in complement, I am trying to trace and identify some echoes of the Lovecraftian horror in David Cronenberg's first movies. For now, I have analyzed Shivers and Videodrome.
Yeah.
In the first one, I have identified some elements such as the mass hysteria, the body transformation, and a character linked to the world of investigation and science. And in Videodrome, I identified that the science and the technology as evil, and they in the motion picture can lead to a horrific reality. And as I suggest for now, the videotape in Videodrome perhaps can be seen as a representation of the Necronomicon. But I don't know. I am still.
But can you elaborate on that? In what sense would it be the equivalent of the Necronomicon?
Yeah, the videotape is the piece, is the object that leads to another reality. And the link between the two worlds and what makes the main character became insane and crazy, and we don't know if he's in some sort of oniric reality or if all of that is are actually happening, or but it's a study that I am still developing, and it's not finished yet.
No, but it's very, very interesting and very intriguing. Now, refresh my memory. Shivers is the one where the sexual disease, basically. Yeah. I mean, of course, Cronenberg. We're really talking horror body, so it's a much more. I mean, the physicality, the sexuality, the corporeality is much more emphasized probably than in Lovecraft. But yeah, I mean, I find intriguing your proposition in terms of finding an equivalent of the Necronomicon as the initiator of an evil reality that takes over, that takes possession of you, and that is contagious. That's basically the Necronomicon is not just an evil, forbidden book, because of course, again, this is a known trope of fantastic or horror literature and fiction. But it's one that makes you mad. I mean, if you read that text, you're going to literally go insane. So yeah, I mean, go ahead and continue that work. I mean, it seems to me that it would be a very, very promising thread. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And again, it would be a nice, because of course in Cronenberg, all of that stuff is highly sexualized, and the Fly, that, or at least the early, as you said. I mean, what he's doing now is somewhat on a different level. Earlier, we were referring also to another famous Cronenberg film, The Brood, which again, it's about the female reproduction and giving birth and all that stuff. So that's
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I would tell you something that I think that this link between the Necronomicon and Cronenberg's movie Videodrome is really interesting. But I think you could also make a link between the machine that Crawford makes in From Beyond with Cronenberg's Videodrome, because for me, I think it's more obvious and more direct, maybe. And I was thinking about something when you talked about Carpenter, because Carpenter's a big fan of Lovecraft. So in some ways it's difficult for us to see if this reference of Michael Myers exists or not, because probably he's a guy that grew up reading Lovecraft, and it's impossible for us to see where are these references he grew up. Yeah. And I always wonder about these differences that you put over there, the elements in Lovecraftian in movies and the adaptations. And this is something I was always thinking, and I came to a small conclusion of mine, and after your lecture over here, I think that my conclusion is really correct based on what you said. I just wanted to put it in. I think that maybe Lovecraft, he has, in terms of elements, he has he can provide great elements for mainstream movies, actually, because it's the mainstream narrative is complicated. But in other words, he's really complicated for this mainstream elements when you talk about adaptation, because all of the reasons that you put over here. This is like an obvious conclusion that I came over here. I just wanted you to say, oh yeah, or oh no, something's wrong.
No, of course, and in that sense, Alien is in a sense a Lovecraftian film, Alien, the film Alien, and it's not an adaptation, but I mean, I think that the most fruitful and productive exercise. Again, I think only someone like Guillermo del Toro can pull it off. I mean, can pull off an adaptation on a big scale, on a big budget, within the Hollywood film industry, machinery, and so on and so forth. Can do it. Otherwise, it's either really, avant-garde, experimental stuff, and we've mentioned a few examples already, or it's along the lines of just using some elements rather than just adapting a story.
Bom, então, acho que é isso, gente. Obrigado pela atenção. Thank you very much, Philip. It was very interesting. E até a próxima.